Alright guys, so basically what we're talking about today is credibility. Which one of the rhetorical triangle does credibility relate to? Remember the Aristotle's rhetorical triangle? We have pathos or pathos, I don't know how to pronounce it really. We have, which one? Very good, Karma, good job. Ethos, so ethos is like credibility, or the who is talking and who is a person quoting, so credibility. Credibility and ethos is a very important rhetorical strategy. It's something that you need to analyze even when you're incorporating sources. Arguably, one of the most important. I would rate it as the most important. Second would be logos, and third would be pathos. That's just Miss Reyes' rating of what I think is important. So basically what the CRAP test involves is figuring out whether or not your source is crappy. It's one of my favorite acronyms. It does stand for specific things. The reason why we go in doubtful, well, we go in assuming something's crappy, is because in research, you're gonna do the opposite of our judicial system. I'm gonna need to change the mask because I'm eating it. All the sources are going to be guilty until proven innocent, instead of innocent until proven guilty. So I want you to approach any piece of media that you come across with skepticism. Enter in with doubt. Who is this person? Why are they saying this? Is that true? Double check, double verify, all of that stuff. Can I have somebody help me out at the computer? I have hand sanitizer. Thank you, Herlander. This is an old, very old PowerPoint that I have edited, but I haven't gotten rid of the slide transitions. You know, those corny, like, letter by letter things. Don't ever do that. I need to redo it. Go next, please. Okay, so in AP seminar, we're going to learn about tiering, credibility tiers. And this is very important when you're being evaluated. Basically, we have tier 1 being the most credible, and then tier 5 being the least credible. Yes?
How come government sources are up there?
How come what?
Government sources are up there.
Why wouldn't they be?
Well, it's kind of flip-flopping nowadays.
No, actually, government source, I'll talk more about it. I'll answer your question in a minute. So tier 1 is going to be our peer-reviewed and academic sources. These are the sources that my job is to push you towards using a predominant amount of the time. These are also going to be our primary sources, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Basically, these are our studies, right? Studies that you find online. They tend to be very complicated to read, involve a lot of statistics, but that's okay. I'm going to teach you how to get around that. Tier 2s are specialized publications and government sources. This would be like the nrdc.org, the CDC, .gov, Department of Labor and Statistics, even things like the census, the census.gov. Yes?
Why is that not tier 1?
I'm sorry?
Why is that not tier 1?
That's a great question. So to answer Oliva's question, the reason why government publications are here is because we're not really talking about sources that talk about the government. We're talking about data that the government collects. So when the government collects like demographic data, wage data, things like that, those tend to be very trusted data sources. Of course, anytime you collect data, there's going to be discrepancies, but it's very trusted. Now, why is it not a tier 1? The cdc.gov is a government website. That is a tier 2. In that website, you'll find basic information. For example, if you're going to define what the coronavirus is in a paper, in an academic research paper you're writing, I would not define via Wikipedia or via the dictionary. You would use the cdc.gov website to define what the coronavirus is. It has informational substance within government websites. The CDC also has an academic publishing subsection called, they have different ones. One of them, for example, is the MMWR, morbidity and mortality report weekly. This now is hosted by the CDC, but it's a peer-reviewed academic publication, so anything published under the MMWR would be a tier 1. So government stuff isn't always going to be tier 1. It depends what is being published. You have subsections that will produce tier 1 level things from the government, but if it's like informational, general information, that will be a tier 2. Okay? Now, tier 3 are our newspapers and reputable organizations. Tier 4, popular magazines. What is the difference between a newspaper and a magazine? Anybody know?
Magazines like more to like show like different things, and like a newspaper that give you like information on like different stories.
What? I didn't hear you well. It's the
Like
masks.
a newspaper will give you like information on like stuff that's like happening, and like a magazine is more to like show you like different like I don't know like products and stuff. Like,
You're getting warm. You're getting warm. Yes. Herlander. And then
So a newspaper has more factual and the other one's more opinion based.
not necessarily. We have op-eds in newspapers all the time. Opinion-based situations. Anybody else want to try? Go Dio.
Good newspapers are peer reviewed, and then
Only academic things can be peer reviewed. But good try. Alright, so this is funny. I always like to say that I teach a class that's super obvious, but you learn a lot of obvious things in my class. So the difference between a newspaper, like ER was saying, is current. What's happening like within the last few days, the last week. Newspaper tends to only publish things that are in the now, that are current. Whereas a magazine is subject-based. Subject-based. National Geographic is a magazine. Time is a magazine. Life was a magazine, right? Those are reputable magazines, but they're by subject. Then you have People magazine, the National Enquirer magazine, Better Home and Gardens, Sports Illustrated. Those are magazines as well. They tend to be more like, what do I say? Not rumors, but more like Pop News or Chimosa. Like, you know, you have those types of magazines as well that are, when we rate magazines, right? Within the magazines, you have different levels of credibility. Like, you're not going to use Sports Illustrated to explain something, right? Unless you're analyzing something about Sports Illustrated publications, right? Unless that's your focus topic. Now, so, and then we also have popular media here. Tier 5. Now, Wikipedia has a little asterisk right there, okay? Wikipedia, social media, blogs, and general sites. That asterisk is important. How many of you have been taught, like, Wikipedia is a big no-no?
yes.
Okay, all of your teachers that said that are correct. It is a big no-no, but not that you shouldn't be using it at all. Wikipedia is a very trusted encyclopedia filled with very verified information. Arguably one of the best encyclopedias in the world, okay? Along with Britannica, and I can't think of any others, but at the moment. But there are other encyclopedias. The thing is, once you get more sophisticated, you're all in 10th grade right now. As you move on in your writing career, because you will be demanded to continue writing all throughout college, my job is to teach you how to become more sophisticated. And part of that is not using encyclopedias or dictionaries to define anything anymore, right? You're going to use Wikipedia as a guide, as a consulted reference, right? Because I consult Wikipedia almost every day. But you're never going to use it to cite anything or to reference anything within your paper. Does that make sense? Okay? So it's not that you can't use it. So Wikipedia could be a tier 2. It's just at the tier 5 level because you can consult it, but you just should never be using it within your paper. Yes?
Wikipedia usually has asterisks that like need to their sources. What if I just use the information and quote the source instead of Wikipedia?
Yes, very good. I really need to change my mask because I'm going to Wikipedia, like you said, is a great jumping off stone. So it will lead you to more of those tier 1s and tier 2 sources. Have you ever scrolled down Wikipedia and seen like the listed sources? Those are the things that you should be citing, like Wikipedia did, to be a more sophisticated writer. For the TAT, remember we're gonna write like 2 big papers in my class. The first one, you're allowed to use a combination of tier 1 to tier 3. No more tier 4s and tier 5s ever again in your whole life. Then by the second paper, you can only use tier 1s. And that's where you will be for the rest of your life, okay? You have to try to only use those tier 1s, but I'll teach you how to cheat, don't worry. Yep. Miss Ray is teaching you what a magazine is, teaching you how to cheat. You go home and tell your parents about this. Today I learned how to cheat and what a newspaper was. I'm so proud of you, son. Okay. Alright, so I basically talked about everything here. Go ahead, go next. So the assignment for today, just to give you a little preview, we're going to be looking at publications. I'll explain more what a publication is in a little bit. And you're going to be organizing the publications into these tiers that we just talked about. The more, just like with Optic, right? These tierings are a guide that you'll then just naturally take with you later on. In the real world, nobody's going to be like, what tier is that, right? That's not really how the real world works. It's just how we're going to start learning how these publications are different and why one is more credible than the other. And why people tend to tweet one more than the other, why some are more popular, okay? And then you'll just gain like an intuition, you'll gain experience, and you'll just gain that kind of sophistication to take with you on. And maybe one day you'll be like, I wonder what tier this is. Like you'll think back to it, but really, it'll just be like second nature, okay, that you'll take with you. Kind of like the Optic, like when you're analyzing what are the parts, what's the interrelationship, but nobody's gonna ask you, well, what's the T in Optic with this? Like, that's not really real life. Before we talk about our assignment today, I wanna talk about the CRAP test. The CRAP test is like an Optic, right? It's another kind of tool that you can use to organize things into the tiers. So for AP Seminar, we're gonna talk about tiers all the time. I will ask you, what tier is this? Why have you chosen to incorporate it? And then you will say, well, because it passed the CRAP test. It's not crappy, right? So it's a tool that we're gonna use for the sources to organize them into tiers. Next. Oh wait, I'm gonna skip myself. We're gonna just really briefly go over what's the difference between a primary and secondary source. You guys kind of know this already, it's easy peasy. Gordia, what's a primary source?
Primary is if you were there and you saw what happened.
Okay, so an eyewitness account, okay? Go to the next slide with the examples. I think there's like 4 examples, so click next. Okay, so eyewitness accounts, so if you're doing research on George Washington and you got some of his letters that now you're gonna use in your essay, and those are primary sources because George Washington like wrote them himself. But also primary sources include academic research, these scholarly articles. Everybody say academic. Everybody say scholarly.
Scholarly.
Those 2 words are synonymous. You're gonna hear people use them interchangeably. An academic source, a scholarly source. Not all academic and not all scholarly sources are peer-reviewed. However, you're gonna hear people use them interchangeably, all 3, okay? But I'm here to tell you, peer-reviewed takes an academic source and pumps it up on steroids. So the peer-reviewed is the ultimate trustworthy source. However, they can still be bad, and there can still be corruption, and they can still suck. So we always have to be wary, okay? That's why I say approach everything with a doubtful eye. Here, results of an experiment, statistical data, even a piece of creative writing, so a poem could be a primary source. Scholarly, academic, peer-reviewed fall under primary sources. Primary sources are considered tier 1. Some books are considered tier 1. Why do I say some books? Because crazy people can publish books too, okay? So you always have to be careful. Tier 1s. Go next. We're gonna go to secondary sources. Next. So, how does a secondary source differ?
It's kind of like you weren't there at the situation. You heard maybe someone told you about it, or you know someone that went through it and they told you the information.
Very good. So, 100 years after George Washington wrote his letters, you now have a historian that writes a book about all of the letters George Washington wrote. And he summarizes them. He tries to, write a biography on George Washington about what he was thinking during certain periods, how he was affected. Secondary sources are arguably just as important as primary sources, however they fall into lower tiering. Right now we have a tier 2. Why do they fall into lower tiering? Why do they tend to be less credible? Believe it.
They can take interpretation of the original piece.
That's where we get into the muddy waters of interpretation. Okay? So you have to be extra careful with whomever is interpreting that primary source. They could be crazy, they could be wrong, they could be incredibly biased and not even know it. So now you as a researcher need to be incredibly doubtful. However, secondary sources is how I'm going to teach you to cheat. And I'm recording myself while I say this. Oftentimes, primary sources tend to be ridiculously difficult to understand. Hence, the problems with interpretation. You yourself need to almost be an expert in the field to understand many of the statistics and scholarly sources, and it can be very cumbersome. So as a researcher, we cheat by analyzing secondary source summaries and comparing them and absorbing that in addition to the primary source so we can have a better understanding. How many of you have ever seen a New York Times article that says, a study in 2018 found that? Anybody seen that? Right? You're reading a newspaper article, you're reading a magazine, and it says, a study found. Usually it's hyperlinked, that you can click on it and find the study. That study is the primary source that you as a researcher should be using in your paper, not the New York Times. But what does the New York Times do for you? That's fabulous. It summarizes it for you. If it's the New York Times, you can basically trust it. If it's Breitbart, don't trust it, right? So it kind of depends which secondary news outlet is interpreting it for you. So my job over the next few weeks is to sort of give you guys that knowledge about different publications that do secondary source material so that you can be a more confident researcher with those tier 1's primary sources that, let's be honest, are difficult at times to understand. And long. And who wants to read all that? But you have to still try to read it. A good researcher will look at all the secondary kind of sources that summarize that primary, and then look at the primary and make sure, like, hey, did they do this right? Does this look, kosher? Does everything meet up? And then if it does, then you can kind of like cheat. And the cheat is you're going to cite the primary tier 1 source only, and you use the secondary sources as a consultant. Consulted sources. It's actually a thing, okay? I know the light is now blurring this.